Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our second panel in our three-part summer series, the Roundtable of Sisterhood. So at this time, I want to thank my esteemed panelists for joining me today for this very important conversation on pay equity, its impact, and our path forward. We have Evelyn Diaz, who is the president of Heartland Alliance for Human Needs and Human Rights, one of the world's leading anti-poverty organizations based right here in Chicago that works in communities in the US and abroad to serve those who are homeless, living in poverty, or seeking safety. We also have with us Dr. Helene Gayle, who has been the president and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust since October 2017. The Chicago Community Trust is one of the nation's oldest and largest community foundations. Under her leadership, the Trust has adopted a new strategic focus on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap in the Chicago region. And then, of course, Dory McWhorter, the CEO of YWCA in Metropolitan Chicago, the oldest and largest women's organization in the region, committed to serving the needs of women and families. Since becoming the CEO in 2013, she has blazed a trail and has embarked upon a journey to transform this 140-year-old social service agency to a 21st century social enterprise. And for those that do not know, I am Sharita Ellens, President and CEO for Women Employed. Since 1973, Women Employed has worked to improve the economic status for women and remove the barriers to economic equity, understanding that the ability to affect the most impact, we have a particular focus on women in low-paid jobs and women of color. So we don't have a lot of time today, and we have a lot to cover. So I want to start off by sharing some key data points to provide a backdrop and to ground us for this conversation. The pay gap is one of the most persistent yet measurable and therefore solvable indicators of systemic sexism and racism in the United States. And I shared earlier that today marks Black Women's Equal Pay Day, the day in which it takes the average Black woman to earn as much money as her white non-Hispanic male colleague earned by the close of 2019. So we have to work 19 and a half months to make what they make in 12 months. While on average, women make 82 cents to a white non-Hispanic man's dollar, the average Black woman earns just 62 cents compared to a white non-Hispanic man's dollar. That translates, and I really want to break this down because you hear that and you don't really understand what that means in everyday terms. So to translate, that means that is a little more than 1,900 lost each month, 23,000 each year, and then more than $900,000 over the course of a 40-year career. By the way, the pay gap for Black women has only narrowed by 19 cents from 1967 to 2018. So what are the drivers of this pay gap? Of course, we have to consider at the top of the list simple gender and racial discrimination. And a lot of people think that that's no longer the case. But just to give you an example of how the biases play into the discrimination today, Time's Up Foundation did a study last month. And in this study, they revealed that 1 in 3 men who make hiring decisions agree that men should have more of a right to a job than women when jobs are scarce. That's a problem. So we put less value on women on women-dominated jobs like childcare, teaching, and home health aides. And then we're still dealing with this occupational segregation where women are overrepresented in low-wage jobs and underrepresented in high-wage jobs. The percentage of Black women who are full-time minimum wage workers is higher than any other racial group. Black women are disproportionately represented in frontline jobs providing essential public services during COVID-19. More than 1 in 3, that's 37% of Black women are in these frontline jobs. Black women are also overrepresented in industries that have seen massive job losses due to this public health crisis, including retail, restaurants, hotels, and the service industry. Nearly 1 in 7 Black women were unemployed in June 2020. We also are dealing with the caregiving burden, where the majority of the home and caregiving responsibilities still fall on women. We also know that harassment and lack of quality job benefits, such as paid sick days, paid family and medical leave, and fair and predictable schedules also impact the pay gap. So what are the effects when you think about, so what does this mean and how is this impacting Black families and our communities? So at the top of the list, you're making more money, you're making less money, so there's less opportunity to build wealth and future economic security for themselves and for our families. White families have 10 times the wealth of Black families. A single Black woman owns $200 in wealth for every $28,000 a single white man owns. The same Time's Up Foundation study I mentioned earlier also stated that of the workers that they surveyed, roughly half of the Latinx, about 51%, and Black women, 48% of Black women surveyed, do not have enough money right now to cover their basic needs. 60% of Latinx women and 55% of Black women currently have less than $200 in savings, compared to 37% of white women and 27% of white men. Just 18% of Latinx women and 26% of Black women have $1,000 or more in savings, compared to 56% of white men. In Illinois, and this is a study that was done by Heartland Alliance, and you're going to hear more from Evelyn later. In Illinois, 67.5% of Black mothers are sole breadwinners. This is compared to 18% for white mothers and 26% for Latina mothers. So 35% of Black female-headed households and 29% of Latino-headed households are at or below the poverty line. In Illinois, 15% of women live at or below the poverty line, but for Black women, 28.6%. and 17% for Latinas, while white women are at 10%. So that was a lot of information that I just shared, and it really does ground us in the importance of this conversation. So at this time, we just want to dive in. And again, I thank everybody for being here today. So my first question is going to go to Dr. Helene Gayle, because we just want to jump right in. The Trust has identified closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap as Chicago's moonshot. How does the gender wage gap contribute to the wealth gap for Black families, or how is closing the gender wage gap key to closing the racial wealth gap?
Yeah, thanks so much. And first of all, just thanks for doing this panel. It's great to be on with my co-panelists, Dory and Evelyn. And, you know, unfortunately, because of some long-standing commitment, I'm not going to be able to be on the whole panel, but I just wanted to be part of this because I think this is such an important issue. And as you were reading the statistics, you know, even somebody like myself that is relatively well-versed in these kind of statistics, I mean, it took my breath away. And I just think, if nothing else, I hope people leave here with a sense of, you know, how serious this is and, you know, how persistent it is. Because I think that's the other part of it, is that this is incredibly persistent. But to your question specifically, so as you mentioned, you know, we put as our highest organizational priority closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, with a particular focus on Black and Latinx communities here in the Chicago region. All of what you just said, I think, you know, kind of highlights why focusing on women in the context of our strategy is so critical, because of how disproportionately Black and Latinx women don't have the kind of income streams that, you know, are necessary, though not sufficient, for ultimately accumulating wealth. And in our strategy, we've kind of looked at 3 streams. One is focused on household wealth, the other neighborhood investment, and the third is around community empowerment that is important to both of those. But if we just look at the portion that looks at household wealth, income is incredibly important part of that. We look at income, we also look at, wealth building vehicles like home ownership, small businesses, as well as debt. And I think if you look at those two, particularly, in the context of what we're talking about, income, which is hugely important, it's a snapshot in time. It's not the same as wealth, which is what you own and what you accumulate, but it's hard to get to wealth creation if you don't have a living wage and the ability to turn your income into assets. And if you're also plagued with debt, which is another piece of this, what you have, you're not able to keep because you're constantly in this downward spiral. So, for us, we've put as a real focus, how are we thinking about women and the roles that they play and the jobs that they could be in, as opposed to some of the lower wage jobs. If we could do more to get women access to high-paying jobs, technical jobs that allow them to have a much different economic future, we could do a lot, not only to close the income gap, but also to help women like that begin to, accumulate assets. And we also put a big focus on women in small businesses because, again, that's an important way of creating actual assets. I think the other part that you highlighted that is so important is recognizing that oftentimes when you're talking about communities where there may be high proportion of single-headed households, that does, a lot of these statistics don't take into consideration the difference between having two incomes. And if your income is low, but you've got somebody else who's earning an income that compensates for that versus somebody who, again, is more likely to get into debt because they're carrying all the financial burden. And so, I just think continuing to tease out these different factors and how can we have an impact on not only decreasing the wage gap for jobs that women currently have, which are the lower paying jobs, but how do we also get women into the higher paying jobs so that they have a different financial future?
Absolutely. And how do we move women that are, in these professions into management and leadership roles, which is, just as important as well. I think I shared in our conversation last month that out of all the Fortune 500 companies, only 37 are led by women. And of those 37 women, only 3 are women of color. Not one is Black and not one is Latina. That's a problem. And, we have to begin to look at how we hold employers responsible for making sure that they are providing the access for women and for women of color to move into some of these more leadership roles that also come with higher pay.
And comment about that, and then I'll shut up because
conversation.
I got to get all of mine in up front, but I guess I would just say one of the statistics that you showed was really startling in some ways, that 1/3 of men who make decisions around women think that men should have greater access than women. It's 1/3, it's not the majority, but that 1/3 is pretty important. And in a lot of the work that we're also involved in, people put a lot of focus on the pipeline, which is important. But, what really is holding people back is what happens once you get into an institution. And how are we taking those barriers away for achievement for women and women of color? Because we can get lots of people through the door, but if we're not making sure that obstacles are removed so that they don't hit this, whether you call it a glass ceiling or whatever, we're not going to change those statistics around how we get women into managerial roles, into boardrooms, into all the ways can make a big difference.
Absolutely. The workplace itself needs to change. It needs to adapt to where we are today as a society, and not where we were when they were originally created, and created for men who had wives at home handling households. So we can get into that. I'm sure Dory will touch on some of that a little later. But Evelyn, so equal pay is often thought of as, a professional woman's concern, and not one that really makes a difference to women making minimum wage and doing frontline work, who are disproportionately, as we shared today, Black and Latina. So how and why is pay equity an issue for women, even in low paid occupations?
Well, thanks, Sharita, for having us on. Helene, you provided some really important, provocative points there too. But as you pointed out, people often do think about the pay gap as this issue that affects professional women, but women are actually underrepresented in high wage jobs, as we were just talking about, and overrepresented in the lower wage jobs. And so, so I want to say something about lower wage jobs, just kind of to set some context for today. And when I talk about lower wage jobs, I'm talking about jobs that people are holding as cashiers and retail workers. So the folks who are checking you out and stocking your grocery store shelves, home health aides and childcare workers, janitors, housekeepers, restaurant servers, cooks, dishwashers. That's the universe of jobs that we're talking about. And Black and Latina women make up a larger share of workers in those jobs. 2/3 of low wage workers are women. Half of them are women of color. And as you heard Sharita say, 65% of them are the sole breadwinners in their household. Now, these are exactly the kinds of jobs that are less likely to come with health insurance, retirement savings, paid sick leave, and other benefits. And their earnings are more vulnerable to things like wage theft and minimum wage violations. So for example, women lose $79 per week. That equates to about $4,100 a year to wage theft, which is 26% more than what men lose in wage theft and minimum wage violations. So, so we're having this conversation on Black Women's Equal Pay Day, and I think we need to acknowledge that the issue of pay equity is both about unequal pay for equal work, and it's about low quality jobs, and those two things conspiring that really make achieving economic security nearly impossible for Black and Latinx women. And that means that we have to focus on pay equity across every job and every occupation if we want to address racial equity in our city and state, because racial justice and economic justice are intertwined like this. And I want to just also make a final point that comes from our Gender Advantage, Heartland Alliance's Gender Advantage report that we'll provide in resources after the webinar. But we pointed out that if we continue to do nothing, women in Illinois won't see equal pay until 2065, and Black women won't see it until 2119. That's the year 2119. That's totally unacceptable, and it's really unnecessary, because over the course of our history, we have made deliberate decisions to create, to make certain jobs be good jobs. And we've done that through policy change and employer education. Just to remind you, TSA jobs didn't exist before 9/11. And those were created and designed to be good jobs. It is in our power to do that, and to make sure that jobs have adequate pay and manageable work schedules, that we value work and leisure in work, and that we're valuing employee voice and contribution. So it's beyond time to commit ourselves to making every job a good job, so that we're not trapping women in this endless cycle of poverty and survival.
Absolutely.
One last stat, though, from our report is that if we do eliminate it, this was a kind of our big headline. If we do only one thing to address poverty in our state, if we were to eliminate the pay gap, just that, if we focused on that, we would increase women's earnings by 16%, cut working women's poverty in half, and benefit 1.1 million children in our state. So if that isn't impact,
Right.
I don't know what is.
I'm glad you shared that, because I was getting ready to ask you to share that stat, because I think that it's extremely impactful when people talk about, well, what is the solution? What can we do? How can we close this? That is a solution, right? So I'm going to ask a question that I saw in the chat box, and then Dory, you can lead with this question, and then I'm going to get to your question as well. And because I think that this is a question that comes up often. So it says, what is your response to mostly men who say the wage gap isn't real, that women just choose lower paid job sectors? Any one of you all can. Dora, you can start, and then if anyone else want to jump in.
After I roll my eyes, that's the first thing. So there's so much, I love this conversation because it is so data heavy. And I'm going to throw out one other data point, that we know that when women enter fields that are supposedly dominated by men, the value and the wages drop. And so stop acting like that we are devaluing that women are going to low wage jobs when women do enter the fields. For example, computer programming, right? We all saw Hidden Figures. That was a menial job. When women were doing it, it was menial. Once men came in, the wage increased. We see that across the board. When men start in these jobs and women start to enter it, the wages decrease. So it's really about devaluing women and devaluing our worth and our work, period. And we use the job statistics to track it, but ultimately that's at the core of what we see happening. So I'll start with there if people want to answer the rest of that question, because I can go on about that point, but that's really what's happening. It's not about that women choose jobs. It's regardless of what job we choose, the wage lowers.
That's right. Did anyone want to add to that before I go into the next question?
Well, I would totally agree. I also think that women are steered into different jobs.
Absolutely.
We choose what we have available to choose. And if you're not told as a young girl about the opportunities that you can have and why you could, be an engineer or, work in coding, et cetera, it's why they're having all of this, girls who code, we're given signals about what's appropriate and not. And so, call it a choice, call it being led into, but along with the fact that I think, as Dory so nicely pointed out, that jobs that become predominated by women, the wages decrease. Mm-hmm. We also have to think about what are we saying about the roles that are appropriate for women and how we are steering women and girls into particular roles and not thinking about how we really equalize expectations as well.
Mm-hmm.
And can I just, on a positive note here, Sharita, you had mentioned that the Time's Up Foundation did this survey, and out of that same survey that I've read as well, the truth is that only 22% of these 2,500 people surveyed, 22% of women said that the reason we see a pay gap is because women choose jobs that pay less, and only 36% of men said that. That's a minority point of view now. What this survey showed was that people are now, both men and women, beginning to cite that society undervaluing women-dominated jobs and systemic barriers are the reason for the pay gap. So I think we should, regard that point of view as a minority point of view and figure out how we can capitalize on people increasingly understanding that we have to fix some systemic barriers.
that is actually a great segue, and you didn't even know that, to what I'm getting ready to ask Dory, because, you know, many corporations do talk about equity, and many people believe that pay equity should be solved. Their practices don't often align with their statements. And so we talked about occupational segregation and lack of representation among the leadership rungs. But besides ensuring equal pay for equal work, Dory, what are the ways that we can close the wage gap? And in your opinion, what is the role of business? What is the role of employers? Because we can policy it to that, right? We can push for legislation, and we need to do that. But at some point, employers have to step up and own this.
Well, this is absolutely an employer-led issue, because ultimately they are the ones that are determining the wages, writing the paychecks, classifying the jobs. All of those pieces happen within the employer's walls. And so it is absolutely important that they do and really look at their systems and processes as well. For example, we've been talking to a particular payroll provider that's already adding additional features to its technology to allow employers to get at this issue quicker, so that they can see that if merit increases were scheduled for whatever, let's say it's $1 million, just making that number up, how did that $1 million get distributed across their organization, so that they can do those own internal analytics. So I think companies have to acknowledge all the data that we already just talked about, but really lean into how are they classifying their jobs. We know that janitors make more than maids. We can argue about what the technicalities of the job is, but the fact is janitors make more than maids. Right? And so how are we looking at the job classifications? How are we assigning the value to those jobs? How are we creating systems to allow us to analyze the impact of hiring decisions, compensation decisions across the organization? And it's the entire organization. I almost hate the way we pit low wage workers against high wage workers, because they're all in the same income statement. That's just the accountant in me popping out. They're sitting there, pick the company, right? There is a corporate income statement that's showing executives and lower wage jobs. The issues are that we're looking at it and saying, oh, you know, women are paid less for whatever. But the fact of the matter is, regardless of the level you choose, we need to address those discrepancies, and corporations have the power to do that. I was looking at some other data that it's, again, regardless of the industry, that you look at higher wage jobs. Anesthesiologists, like the salary for the average for men was over $300,000. The average for women's were $290,000. So it's happening all across the entire workforce, from the top to the bottom. But I think it pits us against each other when we talk about it's a higher wage women issue versus a lower wage women issue. The fact of the matter is, it's a woman's issue. And women of color is where we can start talking about more of those discrepancies versus the levels. Because even women, if you dissected women of color at those higher levels, you'll still see the same issues, like what you already pointed out, Sharita, with what we see in management levels. So corporations have a direct responsibility. Legislation often gets them to act on it, right, but they have a responsibility to dissect these issues. And I'm particularly keen to that now, because we talk about community advancement and we talk about how corporations are often busy now doing their community-based work. But the fact of the matter is that these lower wages are destabilizing our communities. When you think about that, women, that because we already mentioned women at the high percentage of head of households and single-headed households, all those factors we know, it does start with what they are getting paid. And if we already know that 90% of women's income go into their family, their education, their community, by paying them lower wages, you are in fact destabilizing the community, but yet you want to do community service. Pay them, then we talk about community service, right? And so we have to stop disconnecting all these conversations. It all comes back to one point: you don't value us, period.
And I think that's why you can't separate gender equity and racial equity.
Absolutely.
We cannot have conversations about solving the societal ills in our community and solving for unstable housing, solving for poverty, solving for hunger, solving for violence. You can't have these conversations if you're not talking about pay equity. You can't have these conversations unless we're having a conversation about how we shift our value system in the society, so that we understand that anyone that works every single day should have dignity. Anybody that works every single day and 40 hours a week should be able to provide a safe home for their family, and they should be able to provide their children with quality education. Those should be basic needs that any American, right, have access to. And at one point in time, it was closer to that, which is why you could have people that were considered working class or making minimum wage and still be able to buy a home in decent neighborhoods and things of that sort. And we have not kept wages up with the changes in society and with the cost that it takes to just exist. And we haven't kept the wages up with that.
Absolutely. And I'll just say anecdotally, and you're going to have to kick me out because now you got me on my soapbox. Now I'm fired up. But I think about my grandmother's experience, right, where she raised her family in Robert Taylor homes. She became active and in school volunteering. So she eventually went back to school, got her GED, got her associate's degree in early childhood education. She was able to buy her a house on the south side of Chicago based on that salary. That can't happen today because you talked about childcare earlier, in the childcare and the education, early childhood profession earlier. That business is being decimated right now. You cannot take those workers. Those workers don't have the same access and opportunities to move out of poverty like my grandmother was able to do with her family and allow me to then have a platform to sit here today. Like that doesn't happen anymore.
It doesn't.
Because the wages haven't kept track, and then we continue to devalue women because we primarily hold those jobs. So absolutely right. We have a lot to fix, but I believe we go get it done. I'm pretty confident.
Well, we got the right people at the table.
I know, and think about what $23,000 a year would mean to families in all of our communities right now.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's the difference between housing stability, food on the table, clothes for your kids, transportation money. I mean, it is that is the game changer, right? Mm-hmm. And it's being actively denied year after year for every single woman on average, right? Every single woman of color in our communities right now. That's outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And since we're talking about this and we're talking about being devalued and not being paid living wages, so everyone knows about the minimum wage, and what a lot of people don't understand is that people that work tip jobs do not earn even the minimum wage. So the federal tipped minimum wage is only $2.13 an hour. In Illinois, as of July 1st, it is only $6 per hour, and then it ranges up to $8.40 an hour depending on the employer size. And so the sub-minimum wage, as we know, is a legacy of slavery that emerged after the emancipation because they did not want to pay slaves real wages. So they made them work for tips. And this was a way for them to still find a way to legally have free and or cheap labor. So they were forced to work in tipped jobs. And we know today, fast forward, that the majority of people that are in these roles are people of color, are women. And so these tip jobs continue to keep us even below a poverty level. You aren't able to make it unless, let's say, you're in a high-end restaurant, right, where you make great tips. But those jobs typically go to white men. So, we need to make sure that we understand that. So the women in these jobs are experiencing wage theft. They must tolerate a lot of harassment to even get these tips because you are dependent on the generosity of strangers for your wage, and you're working an 8-hour day. And we know that there are very powerful lobbyists that are pushing to keep this on the books, which is why we can't get it done. So at every level in the state of Illinois and in the city, when we fought to get minimum wage increase, we were fighting to eradicate this sub minimum wage. and we had to take it off the docket every time, even at the federal level. It has to be removed from the docket because we can't push minimum wage up with this on there, because you have these lobbyists, these powerful lobbyists that are fighting to allow their businesses to continue to pay people less than a minimum wage. And we also know that the businesses are supposed to keep up with. So if you earn less, they're supposed to make a difference. But a study was done by the Department of Labor, and I want to say that 91% of the businesses that they audited were in violation. So they are not keeping up with it. So, how do we ensure that our call for pay equity includes fighting for a real minimum wage, a one fair wage for everyone? That's also a living wage. And that goes to either one of you.
Yeah, go ahead, Evelyn. I can follow up.
Okay, so I have a couple thoughts. First is, in practical terms, I'll say again, we can make every job a good job. So we have to believe that through policy change, we can turn this around. And at Heartland Alliance, we've been working with Women Employed, other coalition partners, including YWCA, to increase the minimum wage. And there are other policy efforts out there. We're increasing wealth building opportunities through match savings programs and pathways to retirement savings. We're working on changing the structure of work to foster stability and success, including fair and consistent scheduling. And then, of course, recognizing, valuing the vital roles of caregiving for families, and expanding the definition of work through the EITC. There are a lot more ideas that I know Women Employed has been championing. And I think that, so knowing kind of what those are is important, and pushing for these things now feels to me to be the right timing. And here's why. That, again, that same Time's Up survey showed that large majorities agree that it's important that men and women are paid equally. 83% of respondents to that survey said equal pay for women is just as important, or even more important right now in the midst of a COVID-19 and an economic crisis. It's important. And anytime you share these kind of stark numbers with people, that they're outraged. I mean, it's shocking, right? But I think what we need to do is make clear that there is a connection between people's support for equal pay and then these very specific policy prescriptions that we're pursuing in Springfield, because people may not be connecting, the tipped wages effort with this equal pay issue. So they might feel really passionate about this and then feel like, this other one can kind of stay or go. But if they understood that there's a connection, that we're actually trying to address equal pay by pushing for these specific policies prescriptions, I think we could just do a better job of helping people see the connection there. Mm-hmm. And then, I also think we need to push harder and ask harder questions, not just have advocates do this, but have professionals in every single sector ask harder questions of the lobbyists who are attempting to keep the status quo. I feel like that doesn't happen often enough. Like the coverage tends to be advocates are saying this, the restaurant lobby is saying this. Right. And it just ends there. And I think we need to push harder on the lobbyists to explain why they think maintaining the status quo is in the interests of our state and in the interests of the greater good. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, and unfortunately, I navigate these roads between like live conversation and social media. So the first thing that came to my mind was hashtag GTOFH, right? Like it's an antiquated system that needs to just go, period. And to your point, Evelyn, let's talk about the real deal here. When you talk about these wages, I could say this. I used to, in my prior life, I had a Premier Steakhouse as an audit client. And when you see the wage disparities between, to your point earlier, Sharita, you had mentioned the higher salaries earned in these very luxurious steakhouses are very different than, and you don't see the same sort of workforce there that you see in other restaurant environments. So looking at that, there's a couple things that we should note is that, as you look at tips, now that people are moving to more credit card environments, you have an opportunity to track these wages, right? And worker compensation gets impacted, payroll taxes get impacted. So there's a reason that the lobbyists are not wanting to have all of this income disclosed. That's all I'll say to that. And so and let's just keep it real. There's a reason for everything, right? And so that's, you essentially, have opportunities to not fully depict the success of the restaurant is one. But the other piece of this is that we have to use this moment that we're sitting in COVID to really create a system that does work for us. And this whole tipped wage scenario doesn't work anymore. It's antiquated. The legacy of slavery that it was created in, it just doesn't work. And we need to go ahead and have the willpower to create a new model and make sure that we are mindful of everything we've already been discussing today, and equal wages and fair pay for the work and the contribution that these jobs are bringing to society. We haven't talked about that a lot, but the fact that, childcare workers make less than construction workers, and all of these types of things that impact this, and what this gets to the heart of. But there absolutely needs to be just a complete abolition of, it's just out of time, out of place. But now is the time, as we're re-engineering a lot of our financial ecosystems, this just needs to be one at the top. Don't even tie it to minimum wage. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the structure that is antiquated, and then fix the structure, period. And put them into a normal labor pool, and not this tipped pool. It makes no sense.
It makes no sense. And to your point, I do want to make sure that we mention that, this is the time to make these changes. We have an aging population, and many of our parents and grandparents need care. And the people that are paid to take care of our parents and our children make less than a living wage. And so just think about that. Would you want to leave your mother, your child, with someone that does not have job satisfaction, that has so many stressors on their brain because they're trying to figure out how to keep their lights on? They're trying to figure out how to get their own kids to school. They are oftentimes coming to work sick, because in the state of Illinois, we don't have paid sick days. We have it in Chicago. We're trying to get it passed in the state of Illinois through the Paid Sick Days Coalition. And we know that there are more than 1 million people in the state of Illinois that work 40 hours a week that don't have access to one paid sick day. These people are making decisions whether or not to come to work sick or leave their sick loved one at home, because they can't afford to miss the pay. We have to change this conversation, and we have to be very explicit about these conversations and what this means to our society. And we have to elevate the conversation to say, this is not a women's issue. This is a society issue. This is an economic issue. This is a community health issue. This is a public health issue. And we need to call it for what it is, and have those conversations at that level. I want to get to one more question. I saw a very interesting question in the chat box. Let's see if I can find it. Let's see. There's a question that came from Facebook Live, and it said, please address the dilemma of older Black professional women that become subordinate to Black millennials that align themselves with whites and are also biased, which results in being undervalued and possibly early retirement happens to exit from jobs.
I actually think that this is it's a really interesting question, right? Because it gets to this question about all right, well, what if you do see pay parity? Things don't magically get better. And to me, it gets to this question of anti-racism and what work companies are doing to become anti-racist organizations, right? So that you have a way to address incident by incident, kind of issue by issue, culture by culture within a company, what's going on there, to call it out, to have, to have a culture of transparency, so people feel safe talking about that very issue if they're experiencing it in their workplace. But I think we can talk about policy prescriptions. These are all really important, but there has to be a mindset shift, and there has to be a real commitment on the part of organizations to engage in a conversation about bias and racism inside of organizations.
Yeah, and I would just add, to this sort of, I'm assuming black on black sort of discrimination here that we're talking about. I do think role models matter. And I think in the case where you look at that particular millennial that may not have seen other leaders of color that are aware of how their colleagues can be treated. And so that it sounds like that particular millennial sort of adopted to or quickly conformed to sort of the dominant culture relative to that employment space. So in terms of what to do, it's hard to speak to outside of, having a conversation with that individual particularly, but also just remembering that this is why, though, representation matters, so that people have access to different leaders and leadership styles and different mentors and folks that can help them navigate, so that they're not always putting themselves in the position of taking on sort of the dominant culture, not even questioning the appropriateness of that. And so, I know that may not directly solve that particular person's issue, but I just think it does speak to, though, other issues that we see in the workforce without having that type of representation and role models and mentors and leaders that display and demonstrate the type of behaviors that you want to see.
And so with all of this, we have policy, right? We have policies that we want to put in place to bring about a change for quality, good jobs. We have the employer role in terms of just doing the right thing and being transparent about where you are and actually measuring it and doing the work and making those necessary changes and bringing in the mentors and champions that can help move women through the ranks and making sure that your workforce is diverse so that you're creating an environment where women can thrive and want to actually stay. But then there's our role, right? Like as women, what can we do? So can you guys talk about if you've ever had an experience where you had a champion that helped you advocate for higher pay, or where you have gone in and done the work and research and advocated on your own path? Can you share an experience? Because I know a lot of women out there are always looking for suggestions on what can they do to advocate for themselves to get the pay that they feel that they are worth.
Yeah, I think research matters, and I would say that across the board, throughout all the different career moves that I've made, I've used data to advocate for myself in being able to sort of know your worth. I just think that there's just no substitution for knowing your worth. Understanding what's happening in the market, adding to it because the market's depressed for you. So, but I do think it's just important. I know, absolutely, I've had folks that have advocated for me as well. And I think that it's really important that we actually arm ourselves with that information. And because there's just so much more data out there now, and then because we do have laws and, the no salary history laws and those types of things will help us continue to be able to have an environment that we're able to leverage that to continue to move the needle for ourselves. And sometimes I say, I don't necessarily always want to anchor off the average white man because that could be really mediocre earnings. And so how do I think about what value I truly bring to the table and what I'm worth, right? And so I just think we just need to continue to consider that, continue to think about and ask for what we want. And I've had this discussion even internally that people get paid what they accept to some degree. And we're not always in the position to turn things down, but we're always in the position to ask for it. And so I just think if we don't ask, we don't get. And so it's important for us to have the information, know our worth, know our value, know what we can contribute, and request that.
It took me a while to get to where Dory is, honestly, because I didn't, for a long time in my career, I wasn't really aware that I could just go and find comparable pay data to guide my decision making. But I do now. I think that's really important, and maybe a service that, like an organization like Women Employed, can help women access that information easily. But I've been really lucky to have some really strong women and one strong man, and since I'm sure that there are lots of folks here who are workforce development advocates listening in. That one man is Robert Wordlaw, who was my boss at the Chicago Jobs Council. But these were people who really pushed me to take bigger roles, and then other women who kind of reached back and helped pull me up the career ladder. So that upward mobility for me has been the key driver of my own pay progression over time. But even then, I had been the textbook example of somebody who's afraid to ask for what she's worth, because I've consistently undervalued my worth. And it's really been other women mentors who helped me just reevaluate that value calculation. And then summon the courage to ask for something that to me felt outrageous. And so part of it is, I do think we're all aided by just cutting to the chase and understanding really what the market is paying for positions, and then determining, like, all right, well, that's a piece of data where, as Dory was saying, what is my value here? Talking to other people, and then getting the courage to ask.
Yeah, and also knowing, because I see some of the questions in the chat about that's one data point, but also knowing what you're willing to accept or not is another data point in that. And so part of that was, I'm sorry.
What you can. You have to understand what your bottom line is first, and then add on top of that what your opportunity costs. Like, what are you turning down? What are you giving up? How many hours are you going to work? Does that mean that you can't also have a part-time job? Does that also mean that you can't be entrepreneurial? All of those things should go, I'm sorry, Dory, go into account. They did ask, like, where some of the sources: payscale.com, Glassdoor, LinkedIn, there's so many that are out there that would help you, do the research. And I think for me, an eye-opener for me, I've also had champions, both men and women along the way, that advocated on my behalf. But what allowed me to advocate for myself was after I went to business school. And I'm sitting in this class, and it's majority men, majority white men. And we have these conversations of how they're negotiating for their pay, or even how they're applying for jobs. And, as women, we're like, we have to check all the boxes. We have to, and they're like, whatever, I have half of what's on this list. I'm applying and I'm asking for top dollar and then some. And it took them to sit back with us and say, what are you asking for? Are you crazy? Just go in there and ask for this. All they can say is no. And they're like, you're smarter than us on any day of the week. Like, you should not be undervaluing your work or your worth. So yeah, we have to do the work. And with that, we are out of time. I am so happy that we had this conversation today. Thank you guys so much for joining me on this roundtable for sisterhood. I know Dr. Gale had to leave, and I appreciate her joining for the time that she could join us today. We will have yet another one of these in September. So look at all of our social media channels to, see how you can register for that event. That one we will be focusing on young women and how we set them up for success in the workplace. So some of this, we didn't learn, like Evelyn said, till much later. We're going to catch them before they start so that they don't have to play catch up later on in their career, that they're starting off on the right foot. And so with that, we're going to be joined by Anna Valencia, who is our city clerk, Jamila Trammell, who is the founder and CEO of Ladies for Virtue. We'll have Karen Norrington Reeves, who is the president and CEO of the Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership, and two young ladies that just finished our Summer Leaders Program, Lexi Jenkins and Taylor Mazik. And so we're excited about that. Also, for those that are going to be joining us, and I'm throwing my people off because I went out of order. They don't know which slide to put up. For those of you that are joining us for networking, there was a separate link as a part of your registration. It's in the chat box, I believe. So make sure that you click on that. And then also, we just want you to stay connected. Stay connected with us, stay connected with Heartland, with YWCA, with the Community Trust. All of these organizations are doing the work to make sure that we can advance women, that we can advance people of color, and that we are working on behalf of the people that they have a voice, their voices aren't being listened to. So we are amplifying their voices because we are in the position to do that. And I just, want to again just say I am so appreciative that we can have these roundtables, and that we live in a city, or we work in a city, where we have so many women of color now in these positions of leadership, that allows us to have these conversations and bring our perspective to the table, and bring different voices to the table that people are not accustomed to having, which is what I attempted to do here. You wouldn't typically have, the pay equity. Dory and I are always on the circuit this time of year, but to bring in Evelyn's perspective on how this affects poverty, to bring in Dr. Dale's perspective on how this affects the wealth gap, is important, because we need to start making those connections and talking about this holistically. So again, thank you all for joining me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for making the opportunity. Great conversation. Great
Let's
to be
do this, ladies. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.